This is a continuation of Lecture 23 on the fight for communism in Chile. We had gotten up to the last part of the Spanish rule, or of the indigenous post-Spanish rule in the last lecture. And I want to pick up right where we left off. You recall I mentioned Mendoza because it was a big city that had, in Argentina, that had been traditionally important as a source of trade back and forth through one of the lower areas of the Andes Mountains there with the what we call today Chile. Well, that railroad was completed to Mendoza from Buenos Aires in 1895. But now the next task, of course, would be to push it all the way across the Andes, and so that became the next big project around which people wanted to get money so that they could, from some source, so they could finance this railroad construction. In 1878, the Chilean government had increased the issuing of new banknotes to conserve gold and silver and foreign exchange in the treasury reserves. Well, this switch to fiat currency caused the Chilean peso to devaluate, meaning paper currency. However, with the War of the Pacific, 1879 to 1883, the government found it easier to finance by issuing more fiat currency in 1880 and 1881, and the Chilean peso began to falter again, and in 1881 the country prepared for a return to the gold standard and the eventual payment of creditors in hard currency. Now, ruling capitalists fell out among themselves over this entire matter. There were two groups: those who wanted to pay in gold, or if you paid in paper, it had to be in convertible paper convertible to gold on demand. Now, those who were opposed to convertibility were called the paperists, or the papileros. Those who were for gold were called the oreros, because oro is Spanish for gold. In 1892, these oreros succeeded in having the convertibility to gold of currency approved by law. That is, a gold standard, in other words. And in December 1895, non-convertible legal tender was pulled out of circulation. So by 1898, the orero convertible regime collapsed again, however. Crop failures and the ongoing scare due to the severe economic instability caused to investors by the uncertainty of the internecine war's outcomes was responsible for this. Because, in other words, they're saying, well, this paper money you're issuing is non-convertible, or if it's a convertible money, it's only as good as long as you guys are in power. So that isn't the best confidence building mechanism to issue paper under. Paper convertibility to gold was abolished in 1898. The issuing of fiat money continued until 1907. In 1908, a compromise was again achieved, so the currency was issued with convertibility to gold, or supposedly equivalent derivatives composed of potassium nitrate mining, real estate with insured titles could be used, which, as you're going to see, is going to have its own problems, because after 1914 and the invention of the Haber process for making nitrate, this saltpeter, these equivalent derivatives are going to be worth about as much as these house mortgage derivatives are worth in the U.S. today. About around $1,500 trillion worth of derivatives have been issued based on essentially worthless collateral. Well, the Chileans have gone through this same thing over the value of their mines, saltpeter mines. The railroad also facilitated cattle exports from the Argentine pampas to Chile, as we have mentioned. The poor old cattle have to walk across the mountain, but they could get them at least as far as Mendoza. Now, there was a lot of fighting in Chile and Argentina between cattlemen and everybody else, and this finally came to an end in 1902 when some leading capitalist bankers and capitalists themselves in both Chile and Argentina agreed that they would construct the Trans-Andean extension of this Buenos Aires to Mendoza Railroad. And that didn't work out real well either. So what really changed the whole picture once it was done, once that railroad was completed, wasn't just the completion of the railroad, but at the same time there was a gold rush in the south of Chile, in the Tierra del Fuego region, the worst part of Chile or Argentina as far as I'm concerned. But of course, if you're a native like the Yagan Indians down there, you probably like it. But what happened now was this gold rush was down there, and so wherever you have a gold rush, what happens? You have a lot of people coming from other countries where they don't have much opportunity, as in Europe or North America, hoping to strike it rich. So they, especially Europeans, flooded down here into what's called the Magallanes region of Chile. And there was also, when they got done looking for gold, began to think more soberly, they decided to do other things. One of the things they knew how to do, coming from Iberia, was, those that came from Iberia, was how to herd sheep. And so sheep herding became big. So you have a big influx of white people, sheep herding and gold mining, pushing these poor Indians from the south closer to the center. And of course they were always under pressure from the north, but until 1880, yeah, they had been able to withstand that pressure, but now they gave in. I could go into the details of how their economy collapsed under the impact of being pushed closer and closer and closer together, but it's in the book and you can read about it there. Suffice it to say for the moment that in the 1800s, the last Indian resistance was wiped out. Although, now, a man named Diego Portales took over after the liberators. That is, after San Martin, O'Higgins, Bolivar, and the rest of these people that liberated South America from the Spanish. Once they were gone, of course, they had to go eventually. A new generation came up, and in 1830, the most important politician in Chile to emerge was a man named Diego Portales. And he was the boss from 1830 to 1837. And he introduced everything then that Chilean bankers and Chilean capitalists wanted to have in terms of the way their country was going to be run. Everything that they wanted in terms of the laws of commerce. That's when we think, so often scholars that deal with this period call it the Portalian state, which was institutionalized in the Chilean Constitution of 1833 and lasted, that constitution and those concepts about how to run society lasted until 1925. In other words, until a couple of years, 3 years after the formation of the Communist Party there. This constitution concentrated authority in the national government, which was a dictatorship in the hands of the president, who was elected by a tiny minority, and along the way he had institutionalized consigliere in the form of a Congress and a Supreme Court, so that they were supposed to be sure that the ruling families that they represented were properly represented in terms of the law that was going to come out of this government. And the chief executive could serve 2 consecutive 5-year terms and pick his successor. Now, although Congress had significant budgetary powers, the president, who appointed provincial officials, always had the final say in everything. The judiciary was instructed by this constitution to guarantee the inheritance of estates by primogeniture and installed Catholicism as a state religion. In short, the Portalian regime was a dictatorship, Republican veneer, and that's all. Although Portales claimed agnosticism, he said that he was an agnostic, but he believed the church had an important role to play as a bastion of social control and thus class rule stability. He made no bones about why he was supporting the church running things in the ideological sphere, such as schools. And at any rate, he repealed the O'Higgins, Bolivar, and San Martin reforms that threatened church privileges and the vast property ownership the church was engaged in. Portales brought the military under civilian control by rewarding local generals, cashiering troublemakers, and promoting a victorious war against the Peru-Bolivia Confederation of 1836-39 And after defeating Peru and Bolivia, Chile dominated the new political system along the Pacific coast of South America, and with a new ideological banner, that of the ruling class alliance that held power in Chile. And they subscribed to what was then called the liberal economic philosophy. Today it's called the neoliberal economic philosophy, which is everything for the rich, nothing for the poor. It can be put down that way. Of course, in the mechanics of the thing, Portales achieved his objectives wielding dictatorial powers, censoring the press, manipulating elections, institutionalizing a bribed army and navy. For the next 40 years, Chile's armed forces would be loyal looters allowed to share in the exploitation of slave and peon labor, and when necessary, being used to suppress worker and farmer uprisings, as in the ever-increasing domestic conflicts about strikes in 1851 and 1859. The first Portalian president was named Joaquin Prieto, a general who served 2 terms. We could go through all of that, but the truth is you're going to have one guy after another doing the same thing, trying to get a piece of the actions, pushing on the Mapuche in the center of the country, and eventually defeating them altogether. In 1881, Chile signed a treaty with Argentina confirming Chilean sovereignty over the Strait of Magellan. However, to get this, it had to concede eastern Patagonia and other territory it had wrested from Argentina as a result of the War of the Pacific with Peru and Bolivia. Chile expanded its territory northward by almost 1/3, taking the Atacama Desert from Bolivia and Peru in the War of 1879 to 1883. Here, the Chilean capitalists and their new Yankee sponsors acquired the potassium nitrate deposits they had coveted for so long. In the 1870s, the church influence started to diminish slightly with the passing of several laws that took some old roles of the church into the state's hands, such as registry of births and marriages. In 1886, Jose Manuel Balmaceda was elected president, and his economic policies changed the earlier latifundista policy in a new direction. This was the struggle between the gold standard caps and those who wanted fiat currency that we talked about before. The losers in that dogfight deposed Balmaceda, but he refused to step down. A man named Jorge Montt came up in 1891, and eventually Balmaceda fled to Argentina's embassy, where he committed suicide or something. Jorge Montt became the new president. Jorge Montt had been leading the so-called parliamentary forces, and thus the new government was one in which Congress had a role other than ceremonial. And although nothing changed in terms of the oligarchs' ruling of the masses, the parliamentarians were given the role of consigliere in the appointment of ministers and other bureaucrats. A compromise about the currency emerged, and essentially it was, yeah, we'll have a gold standard, and but we'll issue some paper that is gold convertible, and that's the end of the matter. In the U.S., the silver guys lost out altogether, with William Jennings Bryan as their champion. That's when my great-grandfather lost out altogether in terms of his hope for all of the silver he'd been mining up there in central Idaho. Anyway, Chile temporarily solved its border disputes with Argentina, and in the settlement of one lawsuit called the Atacama suit in 1899, the Boundary Treaty of 1881 between Chile and Argentina, the 1902 General Treaty of Arbitration after the completion of the Trans-Andean Railroad. Political authority ran in Chile from the local electoral bosses in the provinces, like a ward boss, up, and they selected the congressman and played a large role in advising the oligarchs upon the question of presidential succession. Cash came largely from taxes on nitrate sales in those years, this is before 1914, and with this cash, congressmen won election by bribing voters. Two new parties grew in importance in the 20th century. that is from 1900 on. One was the Democratic Party. It had roots among urban working class people and urban artisans. That is the kind of people that comprise industrial unions and craft unions. The second one was the Radical Party, representing the petty bourgeoisie in the urban centers, and these are primarily small businessmen and intellectuals. Now, we're going to come to a man who named Luis Recabarren. Now, Recabarren's road to Leninism is the road that leads us to the point at which the Communist Party is actually founded in in Chile in 1922. So, of all of these people that are emerging as leading Chilean communists, he's going to be the number one, most important one initially. And then there are going to be others. He's the one I'm going to concentrate on today. Insight into the Chilean worker struggles on the road to Leninism is reflected in the life of this man, Luis Emilio Recabarren Serrano. Recabarren was born in the port of Valparaiso in 1876 to Basque parents, Jose Agustin Recabarren and Juana Rosa Serrano. His parents were typical, impoverished Iberians from Spain's Basque provinces. Accordingly, the boy, Luis, was forced to start work at a young age, and he did so as a typographer, and because he was working rather than being school enrolled, he had never had very much in the way of formal education. However, his parents were those kinds of Iberians who realized that the only way forward for their children would be if they could get some kind of education, and so he got some pretty good homeschooling there and became a good reader, and as far as I can tell from what he's written, he certainly made up for any lack of it that he might otherwise have had during his elementary and high school years. He married his first wife, named Guadalupe del Canto, with whom he fathered 2 children, and after her death he married again to a woman named Teresa Flores, who he met in political activity. After a trip to the Chilean cities of Antofagasta, Taltal, and Tocopilla, Recabarren decided to take up the cause of the most egregiously exploited of Chile's proletariat, the de facto enslaved nitrate workers. In other words, like Jose Allen in Mexico, Recabarren had looked to, well, which were the workers who are most unhappy? Obviously, it's not going to be those who've got a union card and they're willing to put in 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they're happy with that. That's not going to be our number one target. Well, Jose Allen has gone to the oil field where you had atrocious conditions for workers in terms of hours, wages, working conditions, and so forth. And now Recabarren has done the same thing in Chile, but this time he's picked the nitrate workers. All right, this is 1900. Nitrate mining is not going to collapse until 1914, so in this period of time, he's looking toward a future where he might be able to build a union movement there. In 1894, Recabarren had joined the Democratic Party of Chile, becoming one of its most important agitators and public speakers. He realized that the first task of the educated proletarian vanguard was to create solidarity among all workers, and initially he concentrated his political activities in the city of Valparaiso, where he became director and editor of a newspaper called El Trabajo, the Work, or the Worker. The latifundista capitalist oligarchy jailed him soon after this newspaper appeared, and he did 8 months before winning release. Then in 1905, he moved with his family to Antofagasta, where he became publisher of another newspaper called The Vanguard, La Vanguardia. In May 15, 1906, Recabarren was elected as a deputy to the National Congress for Tocopilla on the Democratic Party ticket. However, he couldn't have been too serious about getting elected to this. I mean, he got elected, but about the job, because when he got in to be sworn in, he said he wouldn't be sworn in because he had to be sworn in on a Bible, and he was an atheist. Well, that's not a position you would take if you were anxious to sit in that chamber, obviously, so he didn't get to see. He moved his family to Iquique. Heavily involved in the labor movement, he organized workers both politically and industrially, as a consequence of which he was again prosecuted by the government and persecuted to escape to Argentina. In that country, he joined the Socialist Party of Argentina in 1908. From Argentina, he traveled to Spain, France, and Belgium, and finally returned to Chile at the end of that year, 1908. After his return, Recoverin was arrested and sent to jail in the Andes for a year and a half. 18 months later, he was released in August 1910. In 1911, he moved back to Iquique, where, unhappy with his party, that is the Democratic Party, and together with a group of nitrate workers, he founded a new party called the Socialist Workers' Party, POS, and POSA, the initials in Spanish, on June 4th, 1912. Now, just a few weeks earlier than that, on May 20th of 1912, he had founded a newspaper called The Awakening of the Workers to promote his ideas. During its existence, from 1912 to 1926, this newspaper was banned by the government several times, but Recoverin continued preaching his socialist credo from any tribune he could get. He moved again, this time to Antofagasta, where he founded El Socialista, the socialist newspaper. In 1915, he was a candidate to Congress for Antofagasta. What's described as a massive electoral fraud in every study I've seen of it was necessary to defeat him in 1915. So as far as he was concerned, he had won that election. But he figured their grass was greener elsewhere, moved back to Valparaiso in 1916, and from there he started a tour through Chile from Valparaiso to Punta Arenas. And he was trying to get a good first-hand view of exactly what the situation was confronting the industrial working class of these different cities. In 1918, he traveled to Argentina, where he participated in the foundation of the Communist Party of Argentina, becoming a member of its first national directory. Now, we need to sort that out a little bit. Searching for Borodin's Road. By the early 20th century, both the Democratic and Radical parties in Chile were winning increasing numbers of seats in Congress. The more leftist members of the Democratic Party became involved in the leadership of labor unions and broke off with Recoverin to launch the Socialist Workers' Party in 1912, as we have seen. The founder of the POS was by now its best-known leader, Luis Emilio Recoverin Serrano. He transformed the POS, the Socialist Workers' Party, into one of Borodin's international bureau parties, joining other Chilean Marxists to form the Communist Party of Chile in January 22nd, 1922. Okay, let's take a little bit closer microscope onto this thing. To summarize, the Communist Party of Chile, Partido Comunista de Chile, abbreviated here as PCCH, began when persons traveling to Mexico City from Chile met with representatives of the Mexican Communist Party's International Bureau in 1921. It looks to me, I don't yet know the exact month or day of arrival, but it looks to me like it was in the middle to latter part of 1921 that Recoverin and some other men, some other Chileans also got up here to Mexico City. They met with, there the Mexican communists took their application to be members of the Comintern, the Communist International, and they've immediately sent those to Moscow and had recommended that these Chilean Marxists who wanted to be Comintern members, who wanted to form a communist party, be given approval to do so, and that they received the Comintern's recognition. And on January 22nd of 1922, Jose Allen, I was trying to think, on January 22nd, 1922, the head of the Socialist Workers' Party, Luis Emilio Recoverin Serrano, joined with these guys who were already there to bring with him his entire POS party and its leadership. Now that's how I've reconstructed this situation. So there was first a group of Chilean Marxists who went up to meet with Jose Allen and make their application to join the Comintern. And Recabra Serrano was in Argentina. I had just come back from Argentina. He was head of this POS party in Chile, and he apparently telegraphed his support to these other Chileans and said that he was going to bring his entire party, POS, Socialist Workers' Party, into the Comintern with them as part of its party. They agreed to that. Jose Allen agreed to that. And so on January 22nd, 1922, that Congress was held in Chile, and it had received Comintern approval. The new party then achieved congressional representation shortly thereafter and played a leading role in the development of the Chilean labor movement. Closely tied to the Soviet Union and the Third International, always from that time on out, the PCCH participated in the Popular Front, Frente Popular, government of 1938, and it grew rapidly among the unionized working class in the 1940s. It then participated in the Popular Front's successor, the Democratic Alliance, not the Democratic Party. Okay, now, well, that's all well and good. It sounds similar to what's happened in other Latin American countries, but what's going to change everything is, of course, the advent of the Truman fascist gang taking over the imperialist government in Washington. So gringo imperialism's task of establishing fascism in its own image over all of Latin America resulted in a puppet U.S. regime outlawing the PCCH in 1948. So it only took the Truman Gang 3 years to crack down on Chile in this exact same way as they were cracking down on Guyana or Guatemala that we've already been talking about, and Cuba for that matter. The party had become a heroic organization in the public eye. It had many mass organizations and prominent support from artists and intellectuals such as Pablo Neruda, the Nobel Prize-winning poet, Violeta Parra, the songwriter and folk artist, a bunch of other people that were extremely popular in Chile, even if they were not widely known elsewhere. This resulted in 1958 in the Chilean government deciding to allow the Communist Party to be re-legalized. Well, of course, that upset the CIA immensely, and from that 1958 time forward, their job is to destroy Chilean democracy and recruit police and army officers to prepare a coup d'etat in Chile, exactly as they have done in Guatemala. But in Chile, it's going to be far different. Guatemala was, after all, a almost all peasant country without much in the way of indigenous intellectual leadership, and to the degree that they had it, it wasn't that hard to get rid of when the CIA overthrew President Arbenz with Colonel Castillo Armas. All right, now I'm going to reflect for a moment on my first contact with Chilean communism. It came about in 1962. About 10 days before the October missile crisis in '62, I was living with the family of Carlos and Evelyn Prieto in Mexico City. That is to say, about 10 days before JFK announced the presence of Soviet IRBM intermediate range ballistic missiles in Cuba and his decision to blockade the island. This was occupying my time because I was already deeply involved with helping the Cuban counterintelligence operating out of Cuban embassy in Mexico City in identifying and documenting various CIA operatives in their activities in Mexico City, and I have described this activity of mine in Volume 1 of my autobiography, Idaho Smith's Search for the Foundation, entitled The Buccaneer, which you can look up in the libraries if you go to the website www.worldcat.org, world and then the letter CAT.org stands for World Catalog, or you can type in my name or that series, Idaho Smith Search for the Foundation, or that Volume 1 is called The Buccaneer, any of those, and it'll come up and you can see where the nearest library to you might be that would have it. Or for $3 you can get the second edition of that book from Kindle Books in ebook form on Amazon.com. Now, one day when I was returning to the Prieto home in San Angel, that's a well-to-do section of Mexico City, I was introduced to a young man we shall call Mr. Swiss. I haven't decided yet whether, when we bring this chapter or the story of Chile up to modern times in the 2016 version, by then I should find out if this guy's still alive. I don't think he is. I think he was murdered by the Pinochet gang, but just in case, before I throw his name out here, I'm going to try and find out if the poor fellow is still alive. So at any rate, I met this guy at the home of Carlos and Evelyn Prieto just a few days before the onset of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he had come directly to Switzerland, and he had been expected by Carlos Prieto, although Carlos had never said anything to me about it. He was a recent graduate with a higher degree, and that's as much as I can recall at the moment. This gentleman was heading for Chile to link up with the Communist Party in that country. And the last time I saw him was just a day before Carlos and Evelyn and his family, or their family, and I headed for our refuge to wait out the imminent fall of missiles that would trigger World War III. We all went to Tepoztlán. This guy, the Swiss fellow, left Mexico City on a flight to Santiago, Chile, and we dropped him off, and we went straight from there to the capital of Morelos, a long famous city in both Mexican revolutionary history and in anthropology. That is the city of Tepoztlán. I had a rather negative opinion of Mr. Swiss. It seemed to me that what was needed in any country fighting for communism at this critical historical juncture was people such as myself who knew firearms, had military experience, and were up to the dirty tasks of war. This guy was a European intellectual type, thinking about what I thought of as a lot of nonsense. He had a smattering of revisionist ideas about how to build a new society without giving primacy to the importance of the armed struggle. Enough said about that. Because, whatever I thought, I kept my thoughts to myself. Why? Because Carlos and Evelyn, who were my benefactors, thought highly of Mr. Swiss and his intellectual and educational notions and backgrounds. So I decided just to keep my opinions to myself. As I have described in The Buccaneer, I had tasks to perform after the missile crisis was resolved in the Kennedy-Khrushchev deal that bought Cuba freedom from gringo attack in exchange for missile removal. Thus I headed toward the U.S. once more in December '62, first to Louisiana and then onward to Boise. And I tell that story in the book, The Buccaneer. The very last thing Carlos said to me before my departure was something like, "You know Mr. Swiss, what he looks like. He's going to be doing some work for us in Chile, and I expect to send some information to him and to get some from him, and that can only be done face to face. So it's possible you will hear from me in the future to come back and then do a job for me along these lines." That's the best as I can remember that. And I had agreed that if he should call for me, that is, if Carlos should call for me, I would return and conduct such a special mission. Little did I know then that the CIA would redouble its efforts to overthrow the mass movement of Chilean workers via the bloody coup d'etat of General Pinochet. In the coming decade, I would be sent on James Bond kind of missions to link up with Mr. Swiss, and this is a story, as I say, that we may continue in the, we'll continue it one way or the other, but in the Chilean saga in the 2016 edition. I would like to think that this fellow might have survived, but I very much doubt it. At any rate, back at the Chilean ranch, the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914 caused a severe drop in traffic along Chilean ports due to shifts in the maritime trade routes. In addition to this, international trade collapsed and state income was reduced to half of its previous value after the start of the World War in 1914. The Haber process, or Haber process, I'm not sure how that's pronounced, first applied on an industrial scale in 1913, now was used as part of Germany's war effort due to Germany's lack of access to Chilean saltpeter. And this had ended Chile's monopoly on nitrate that process had, and led to an economic decline in Chile, as I described to you before. While nitrate mining gradually waned in importance, copper mining rose. Thus, the export of raw materials rose to a level unprecedented in the history of Chile. For example, by 1929, copper exports had reached the same value as nitrate exports, and in 1937, the value of copper exports largely surpassed that of nitrate. In the 1920 to 1937 period, both industries had combined a 30 to 83% share of Chilean exports. Now, by the 1920s, it wasn't just the working class that was emerging with revolutionary communist leadership. The middle classes, meaning the petty bourgeoisie, and part of the AFL type of working class, guys that could actually afford to pay union dues for a prolonged period of time, promoted a fellow named Arturo Alessandri Pullman. Alessandri is what we're going to call him in here. And he had an entirely new approach to things. He wanted to do away with all of the Portales Constitution, the old the kind of hierarchy that had been overthrown in Mexico in 1910. They wanted to overthrow there too, and in 1915, Alessandri was elected to the Senate, representing the mining districts of the North, and there he earned the title of Lion of Tarapacá, the town he was from. As a dissident liberal running for the presidency, Alessandri attracted support from the more reformist radicals and Democrats and formed the so-called Liberal Alliance. He received strong backing from the petty bourgeoisie and working classes, as well as from the provincial cities elites, and students and intellectuals rallied to his banner. At the same time, he reassured the landowners that social reforms would be limited to the cities. As usual, it's an easier line to sell to a broader spectrum of people than a hardline Leninist revolutionary line is to sell. Well, he found that the conservatives in Congress couldn't block his advance. He got involved in a long-running war with them. Military officers, young ones, began to come to his support. They seized power in 1924. They put him in office, and then some other military cadets or younger officers favored his ousting in January of 1925, not long thereafter. All this saber rattling, the ruido de sables, saber noise of September 1924, provoked by discontent of these young officers, mostly lieutenants from middle and working classes, led to the establishment of the September Junta by General Altamirano and the exile of Alessandri. And after fears of a conservative restoration among progressive officers, and the following January 1925 coup, there came to be a kind of live and let live attitude between these two groups of army officers and the classes that they represented. Two colonels, Ibanez del Campo and Marmaduke Grove, returned Alessandri to the presidency in March of 25, enacted his promised reforms by decree, and Alessandri, having resumed power in March, got his new constitution and everything else passed that he wanted by September of that year. So, things finally settled down again. The new constitution gave more power to the presidency. Alessandri broke with the classical liberalism's policy of laissez-faire by creating a central bank and imposing a revenue tax. However, angry students and workers were crushed, leading to the Marussia massacre of March of 25, followed by the La Coruña massacre. So Alessandri proved to be another labor faker, another Obama type who will say anything to get elected, and once he's there, he's going to do 180 and start moving the other direction. The longest lasting of the 10 governments between 24 and 32 was that of General Carlos Ibanez, who briefly held power in 25, again in 27, again in 31, in what were de facto dictatorships of the privileged classes. The petty bourgeoisie took command under the radical power in 1932, radical party, I'm sorry, in 1932, and until 1952, they held on to it. Now, the Seguro Obrero massacre took place on September 5th, 1938, in the midst of a heated three-way election campaign. And what came out of that is everybody that wasn't part of the ruling class or the upper part of the petty bourgeoisie had now figured out that no matter what happens in my lifetime, this is going to be a fight between generals and people who have a power base among classes other than mine. I'm not going to bother going into the different political parties and the positions that they took during that period of time, except to say that from 32 to 52, the Chilean state increased its role in the economy, and wherever it was necessary, it also slaughtered workers and poor farmers in one after another massacres, which apparently worked for a few years, and then things would get so bad that people would start to revolt again. Okay, in 52, voters returned Ibanez to office for another 6 years. But in 58, Alessandri came back for another 6 years. But the gringos by this time were not about to put up with any nonsense in Chile. They had straightened things out down there once in 1948, and now here it is, 1964, they're going to have to straighten things out again. They back a guy named Eduardo Frei, and they put him in office but in 64, but he had so many problems between people in his left coalition who were tired of his Obama antics of saying one thing and then the next day turning around doing the exact opposite, that he lost their support. And of course he never really had support of the most reactionary ruling oligarch families at all, and what they wanted was for the U.S. to institute an outright fascist rule, as they had done in Guatemala, for example, or Nicaragua. That's what they wanted for Chile. So Frei was in a lot of trouble. In 1970, in the presidential election, the whole thing played out. This is an election that featured Frei running against Salvador Allende Gossens. Most of you will just know him as Allende. He won a plurality of votes in a three-way contest. Allende was a Marxist physician and a member of Chile's Socialist Party. The Socialist Party was at the head of the Popular Unity Coalition, which included the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, the Radical Party, and some social democratic parties, along with a few disaffected and disgruntled Christian Democrats. The Popular Unity Action Movement and the Independent Popular Action. So this was a pretty big coalition. Now, 1970 to 1974 are the only years that this democratic anti-imperialist coalition is going to rule in Chile. Why? Because you'll recall the CIA has been planning actively to, since 1958, to impose its own form of fascism on Chile. In 1974, they launch General Pinochet's military coup, which kills Allende, and thousands of others are rounded up and tortured and killed. And this is something that goes on for years. I'm not going to pursue it any further here, except to say we're going to stop our lecture about Chile in 1974 with the end of the first Allende administration, overthrown by a fascist military coup of the local rulers who never liked anything that was liberal whatsoever, and the U.S. imperialists who worked together to bring about a collapse of the Chilean nation. And for a number of years, the Pinochet regime holds power and keeps Chile within the U.S. orbit. That's all changed, of course. So in our when we continue with these lectures, and after the 2016 book is written, I'll bring all of this up to date, and you'll be able to see exactly what happened.